So let's talk about the concept of a marginal rate of substitution, which is a concept that's used any number of times in consumer theory. Now there's another term that sounds very similar to it, which is used in production theory, called marginal rate of technical substitution. So if you hear that, that's about the technology. That's really the analog to this. But marginal rate of technical substitution is on the production side. Marginal rate of substitution is on the consumer side. Now, it is ultimately about the trade-off between consuming two goods for a consumer, keeping the level of satisfaction, the utility, constant. It's inherently about a feature of an indifference curve, because you're going to keep the level of utility the same. Now, in a different video, we've talked about a utility function where we've got that the happiness, if you will, of a consumer consuming X and Y depends on this function. Because we're talking about an indifference curve, we're going to keep the level of utility constant. So do just a little bit of algebra here, and then depict it on a graph, and then relate it also to demand curves. So let's imagine that we're looking at how utility might change. So we're going to let delta U be the change in utility. And that can happen using this utility function because the Y has changed, okay, the level of Y has changed, a consumption of Y. It could be because the level of X has changed, so both of those can play a role in changing utility. But we also have not just how much Y has changed, but how sensitive consumers are to, in terms of the utility, to small changes in Y. And I'm going to depict this as the change in utility divided by the change in Y. Now, sort of loosely, you can think of these delta Y's as canceling out and left with the change in utility, but let's leave it in here. And this, how utility changes with a small change in Y, is another way of saying the marginal utility of Y. Okay, these two are the same thing. And then we've got the change in Y. So this is how utility can change when I change how much I consume of this, and then sort of the marginal effects. Plus the analog for X multiplied times how many units of X have changed. And then we've got the change in utility, which we are holding constant because we're looking at an indifference curve. So sort of write this out. Okay, this is sort of the general form, and then we're going to substitute these definitions of marginal utility into these things with the parentheses and holding utility constant. Now let me just rearrange this. I'm going to pull this over to the right-hand side and divide through by the marginal utility of Y. So what I get here is that the change in Y over the change in X is going to be equal to the marginal utility of X over the marginal utility of Y. Now, a couple of things to note here. I have substituted in the definition of marginal utility, and I've held utility constant. That's really an important part of this. And we've got a negative sign here. Now let's, for general purposes, well, let me leave it there for now. Okay. So if we look at an indifference curve with x and y on these two axes, an indifference curve has a constant level of happiness. Utility is constant. What this marginal rate of substitution is, and this is the marginal rate of substitution, this term on the right, it's basically looking at the slope of an indifference curve at any particular point. Okay? That slope is going to be change in y, the rise over the run. So at this point, there is a value for the marginal rate of substitution. It's just the slope of the indifference curve. And it can be written this way. Now I want you to think about what would happen if I consumed not x1 and y1, okay, at this point, but instead 0.2 of x2 and y2. Now what's going on here? I am increasing the consumption of x. I am decreasing the consumption of y, and this slope has gotten flatter. Now, so I mean that's kind of just pretty obvious from this combination on the of the slopes. But what does that mean in terms of the economics of this? What you have here is that you're consuming more x. The marginal utility of x is going down as you consume more. In this standard indifference curve, the more you buy of x, the less you get in terms of benefits. That's another way of saying that the demand curve slopes down. I get less benefit by consuming more and more x. So marginal utility of x is going down. The marginal utility of y, as I consume less of it, is going up. As I buy less of it, the marginal benefit of consuming 1 unit of y has gone up. Now, oftentimes, this marginal rate of substitution will be defined in terms of an absolute value. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. It just depends on the context. But you should keep in mind that it's the slope. It's just the slope of an indifference curve. Now that's going to, this marginal rate of substitution is going to be closely related to relative prices and consumer choice, which we'll see in another video. But this is how you define and depict the marginal rate of substitution, slope of an indifference.